The wind howled through the cracks in the door, carrying with it a biting chill that seemed determined to break through every inch of warmth inside the room. It rattled the window panes, as if challenging the very foundation of the house. Laura sat motionless in her worn armchair, her gaze fixed on the dark, almost infinite expanse of the lake outside. Occasionally, flashes of lightning streaked across the horizon, illuminating the villa for just a split second, but it was enough to tighten the grip in her chest. In that fleeting light, she saw a figure standing under the porch roof, its shape shadowy, mysterious, utterly unfamiliar yet strangely familiar at once. "Elliot," she called softly, her voice barely rising above the storm's fury. But there was no reply, only the relentless gusts of wind that seemed to mock her vulnerability, carrying the words away before they had a chance to settle. She stood, her legs trembling, fighting to steady herself as she moved toward the door. Her heart pounded heavily in her chest, a rhythm driven as much by fear as by something nameless stirring deep inside her. As she opened the door, a rush of icy air swept in, carrying fine droplets of rain with it. And there he was, Elliot, standing on the doorstep. His sweater was soaked, his hair plastered to his forehead, and his eyes, those piercing, unwavering eyes, held something she couldn't bear to confront. "You shouldn't be here alone," he said, his voice low, almost swallowed by the wind. "It's not safe for you." Laura froze, a lump forming in her throat. "Not safe," she repeated, a hollow laugh escaping her lips as she tried to mask the chaos inside. "I'm safer than you think, Elliot. I came here to hide, not to face anything." Elliot took a step forward, his broad shoulders seeming to block out the world behind him. "Hide?" he asked, his voice growing more urgent. "Do you think that can go on forever? What you feel, what we feel, it doesn't just disappear, Laura." His words hit her like a blow, leaving her stunned. Another flash of lightning illuminated his face, his deep blue eyes burning with a determination and a quiet anguish that made her want to look away. She wanted to retreat, to slam the door and keep everything outside. But her body betrayed her. She stood there, rooted to the spot, feeling as though every shred of reason was being swept away by the storm. "You don't know what you're saying," she whispered, as if trying to convince both of them. "I know I do." He leaned in closer, his eyes locked onto hers. "I've waited too long, Laura. Waiting for you to see me, for who I am, not just as a son." A strong gust of wind slammed the door shut behind her, the sharp bang echoing through the empty room. Laura flinched, but Elliot's gaze never faltered. In that instant, she realized that something between them had shifted, something that went beyond tonight. It had been building for a long time, and now there was no place left to hide. The storm had come, and it was swallowing them whole. "Come inside, Elliot," she said, her voice breaking the heavy silence. "You'll catch a cold." But as he crossed the threshold, she knew that by opening that door, she had stepped into a place she should never have entered. The rain continued to patter against the windows, whispering secrets of memories Laura couldn't silence. She sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped tightly around a mug of tea that had long gone cold. The dim glow of the overhead light cast soft shadows across her face, highlighting the weariness etched deeply into her features by time and solitude. The faint creak of the wooden door behind her sent a shiver down her spine. She turned, startled, only to find Elliot stepping in, his hair still damp from the rain. "Can't sleep either?" she asked, her voice striving for calm but faltering slightly. Elliot shrugged, his eyes shadowed with thought. "Hard to sleep with rain like this. What about you?" "Another sleepless night." Laura hesitated, letting silence hang heavily between them before she spoke. "I think there are nights when it's not the rain keeping you awake." Her words drifted into the air, light yet weighted, suspended in the fragile space between them. Elliot didn't respond immediately. Instead, he pulled out a chair and sat across from her, his gaze lingering on her face. It was as if he was trying to unearth the secrets she had spent years burying. "Are you always like this?" he asked suddenly, his voice low but laced with a quiet challenge. "Keeping everything bottled up, never saying what you really feel?" The question hit her like an unexpected blow. Her eyes widened, as though he had touched a raw nerve, one she had worked so hard to keep hidden. "I don't know what you're talking about," she replied, but the slight tremor in her voice betrayed her. "I think you do," Elliot said softly, his gaze steady and unwavering, deep and calm, like the lake outside. "You pretend to be fine. You pretend everything's okay. But I don't believe it. No one can be so alone and still be okay." His words sliced through the fragile facade Laura had spent years constructing. She inhaled sharply, fighting to keep her composure. "Elliot, some things are better left unsaid. Some things don't need to be understood." Elliot leaned forward, resting his hands together on the table. His voice softened, but grew sharper in its intent. "But if you don't say them, how do you keep living? How do you hold everything inside without breaking?" His words pulled Laura back into a torrent of memories she didn't want to confront. She had once been a woman brimming with ambition, filled with stories and dreams she wanted to share with the world. But Ethan, the man she had given her heart to, only to have it shattered, had demanded otherwise. "Writing is just a foolish distraction," he had told her, his cold gaze dismissing everything that made her feel alive. Laura had packed away her aspirations, locking them deep inside her, and became the perfect wife by his standards. Yet, even as she tried to hold the marriage together, Ethan had left her with nothing but the ruins of what she once believed was her life. Elliot's gaze remained steady, unwavering, pulling her back to the present. "You don't know what I've been through," she said finally, her voice breaking with the weight of unspoken pain. "You wouldn't understand." "Maybe not," he replied, his tone gentle yet piercing. "But I do know this. The feeling of being abandoned, dismissed, forgotten, it doesn't go away. It only grows until it swallows you whole." His words hit her like a wave, threatening to sweep her off her feet. She saw herself reflected in his eyes, eyes that carried the pain of his mother's absence, the neglect of his father. But deeper than that, she saw a longing for understanding, for connection, something she wasn't sure she had the strength or the right to give. "Elliot, you have to understand. We all carry our own burdens," she said, though even as she spoke, her words felt hollow, insufficient to create the distance she so desperately needed. "And you?" Elliot asked, his voice unwavering, his eyes locked on hers. "Are you living, Laura, or are you just surviving like me?" The question left her breathless. She had no answer because, deep down, she knew he was right. She wasn't living. She was merely existing, clinging to the remnants of a life she had let slip away long ago. And now, sitting across from her, Elliot, with his piercing blue eyes and steady, quiet voice, was forcing her to confront everything she had buried. Outside, the rain grew heavier. Its rhythm drummed against the windows like a heartbeat. Laura felt as though she were standing on the edge of a tempest. A storm raged outside, threatening to swallow her whole. Yet, a part of Laura wasn't sure if she wanted to fight it anymore. The rain continued its relentless rhythm, cold, unyielding. Thunder rolled in the distance, a vague warning that Laura chose to ignore. She stood in the dimly lit living room, the soft glow from the table lamp casting weary shadows across her face. Tonight, the lakeside villa felt heavier, more suffocating than ever before, as if the walls themselves were inching closer, suffocating her. Her chest tightened with an indescribable weight, a pressure that no amount of air seemed to relieve. Elliot stepped into the room, bringing with him the chill of the storm. His damp t-shirt clung to his frame, his jeans soaked through, but he showed no signs of discomfort. He set his umbrella down with an almost deliberate motion, his sharp gaze locking onto Laura as if searching for something buried deep within her, something she wasn't even sure existed. "You shouldn't be out walking in this weather." Laura broke the silence, her voice quiet and strained, as though the tension in the room had fractured her words. "And what about you?" Elliot replied, his tone low but laced with challenge. "Why do you always sit here like you're waiting for something to happen, but you never say it, never do anything?" Laura froze. His piercing stare felt as though it had cut straight through the walls she'd spent years constructing. It exposed everything she'd worked so hard to conceal. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, attempting to keep her voice steady, but the tremor was impossible to hide. "You know exactly what I mean," Elliot countered, taking a step closer. His presence overwhelmed her, his voice calm yet stormy, wrapping around her like the winds outside. "You know it better than anyone. But you're afraid. Afraid to admit it." "Elliot, stop." Laura's voice rose louder than she had intended, cracking under the strain. But Elliot didn't move, his gaze unwavering, his stance unyielding. "You don't know what you're saying. And what about you? Do you know what you're doing?" Elliot tilted his head slightly, his words sharp yet tinged with an ache Laura couldn't ignore. "Since the day I came here, I've seen it. You're not happy. You pretend. You avoid. But I can't pretend I don't see it." Laura turned away, desperate to end the conversation she felt spiraling out of her control. She took a step toward the hallway, but Elliot followed, his hand reaching out, grasping her wrist, not forcefully, but firmly enough to stop her. "Laura," he said softly, her name falling from his lips without hesitation, no formality, no distance. For the first time, his voice was intimate, like a confession. "You're not the only one who feels abandoned. I do too. And I can't keep pretending that you don't matter to me." The words hit Laura like a tidal wave. She turned back to face him, her eyes meeting his. His deep blue eyes glistened with something she couldn't name, anguish, longing, and a truth she wasn't ready to face. She wanted to speak, to refute him, to deny everything, but the words lodged in her throat. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We can't. We're not supposed to. But you feel it too, don't you?" Elliot asked, his gaze never wavering. "You don't have to say it. I already know." A crack of lightning split the sky, illuminating the room for a fleeting moment. It lit up Elliot's face, etched with pain and defiance, and the small, fragile space between them. Laura could feel the pull of him, an unspoken gravity that had been building for so long. She wanted to step back, to close the door on whatever this was. But her body betrayed her. Her feet were rooted to the spot, her resolve slipping away like the rain sliding down the window. Her lips quivered. Before she could think, before she could reason, Elliot leaned in. His kiss was gentle, hesitant, like he was giving her a chance to pull away. But she didn't. She felt the warmth of him, the quiet desperation, and for a brief, dangerous moment, she let herself forget. She let herself sink into the oblivion of his touch, forgetting guilt, responsibility, and reality. When they pulled apart, the silence in the room was deafening. Elliot's gaze lingered on her, filled with emotion. Laura's breath quickened, her chest tightening. "What have we done?" she murmured, her voice barely audible, her eyes dropping to the floor to avoid his. "Something we can't deny," Elliot replied, his tone steady, resolute. "You can keep running, Laura. But you can't keep denying this." His words weighed heavily on her, suffocating, undeniable. Without another word, Laura turned and walked away, her steps hurried, unsteady. She didn't stop until she reached the safety of her bedroom, the door closing behind her with a finality that did little to quiet her pounding heart. She leaned against the door, gasping for air, as though she had just survived a storm she wasn't sure she had wanted to escape. Outside, the rain intensified, hammering against the windows with relentless ferocity. But within Laura, a far greater tempest raged, threatening to unravel everything she had once held firm. The walls she had built around herself were crumbling, and she couldn't tell if she had the strength, or the desire, to rebuild them. The rain no longer whispered. It roared against the villa's roof like an unrelenting force, amplifying every unease in Laura's chest. She sat curled up in the old armchair in the dimly lit living room, her hands clutching the hem of her dress as though letting go would send her spiraling into a storm of emotions. The memories of what had transpired with Elliot haunted her, sharp and unrelenting, like a wound that refused to heal. Footsteps echoed from the hallway, firm and deliberate. Laura looked up, her heart sinking when she saw Clare, her only true friend, standing in the doorway. Claire's piercing eyes swept over Laura before settling on the stairs, the staircase leading to Elliot's room. Without saying a word, Claire entered, set her bag on the table, and poured herself a cup of tea. Her movements were deliberate, calculated. "Laura," Claire finally spoke, her voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of something unspoken. "You look like you've just been through a storm. Is there something you want to tell me?" Laura bit her lip, struggling to keep her composure. "It's nothing. The weather, it's been rough, and I haven't been feeling well." Claire smirked, a fleeting, hollow expression, devoid of warmth. "Is that so? Because I can't help but feel there's something more to it." She sipped her tea, her eyes never leaving Laura. "Like there's something you're hiding." Laura froze, pinned to her seat by the weight of Claire's words. They weren't an accusation, but they hit their mark, striking at the fears Laura had been trying to bury. Before she could respond, Claire set her cup down, leaned forward, and fixed Laura with an icy stare. "I saw Elliot coming out of here last night," Claire said, her words landing heavy, like the rain outside. "Do you care to explain why?" Laura's heart stopped. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Laura knew Claire was too sharp to be deceived. Her friend's unwavering gaze seemed to unravel every thread of the facade Laura had so carefully constructed, and now Claire was waiting for her to confess. "What are you thinking, Laura?" Claire pressed, her voice cutting through the thick silence like a knife. "Do you even realize what you're doing? Elliot is Ethan's son. He's the son of your ex-husband." "Claire, that's enough." Laura tried to protest, but her voice came out weak, unconvincing, even to herself. "Enough." Claire's laugh was short, bitter. "I always thought you were stronger than this, Laura. But now, I don't know what you're doing with your life." Laura couldn't bear Claire's gaze any longer. She stood abruptly, intending to flee, but Claire grabbed her wrist, her expression fierce with resolve. "Where do you think this is going?" Claire demanded, her voice low but laced with intensity. "Do you think Elliot is just a boy? He's not. He's a man, and you've crossed a line no one will forgive." Before Laura could respond, a loud noise from the staircase broke the tense silence. Both women turned to see Elliot standing there, his face pale, his eyes dark with hurt and anger. It was clear he had heard everything. "Elliot," Laura's voice trembled, barely audible. "What do you think I am?" Elliot asked, his voice thick with disappointment. "A mistake you want to forget? Or a game you're playing to escape your miserable life?" Laura felt the weight of his words like a physical blow. She wanted to explain, to tell him it wasn't what he thought, but the look in his eyes told her he wouldn't listen. Claire remained silent, her sharp eyes observing everything, withholding further words. She seemed to have decided to step back, leaving Laura and Elliot to face the consequences of what had unfolded. As Claire left the room, the sound of the door closing behind her rang like a funeral bell, marking the collapse of everything Laura had tried to hold together. Elliot descended the stairs slowly, his gaze fixed on Laura with unrelenting intensity. "You want me to leave, don't you?" he said, his voice low, laced with bitterness. "Fine, I'll go. But don't expect me to come back." "Elliot, wait," Laura pleaded, but he was already at the door. Without looking back, he stepped out into the pouring rain and disappeared into the night. Laura stood frozen, her world crumbling around her. The rain outside grew heavier, pounding against the windows as if trying to wash everything away. But Laura knew that what had happened couldn't be erased. She had crossed a line, and now she had to face the consequences, not just with Elliot, but with herself. As the storm raged on, the walls of the villa seemed to close in on her, leaving her with nothing but the echoes of her choices and the haunting realization that some storms couldn't be weathered. The lakeside villa lay shrouded in darkness, broken only by the relentless pounding of rain on the roof and the eerie whistle of wind through cracks in the doors. Laura sat in the living room, clutching a cold cup of coffee as though it were her last lifeline. She hadn't moved from the chair since Elliot had stormed out, the echo of his retreating footsteps still lingering in her mind, a haunting farewell she never wanted to hear. Everything around her now felt like shards, fragments of her life and emotions she never should have allowed herself to fall into. Suddenly, the front door swung open, letting in a gust of icy wind that made Laura flinch. She turned quickly, but it wasn't Elliot. It was Clare. Clare entered briskly, her expression stone cold, her sharp eyes carrying the weight of a decision already made. Laura opened her mouth to speak, but her throat constricted, words failing her. "We need to talk," Clare said, her voice steady and commanding. Laura said nothing, watching as Clare approached. She knew there was nothing left to explain. Clare placed a folder on the table and sat down, her movements deliberate and unyielding. "Do you know what bothers me the most?" Clare began, her tone laced with controlled anger. "It's not just what happened between you and Elliot, though that's bad enough. It's that you let yourself get caught in something you knew would destroy you both." Laura hesitated before opening the folder. Inside were photos, grainy but unmistakable, of her and Elliot, captured from a distance, moments she thought no one had seen. But it was the final photo that made her blood run cold. Ethan, her ex-husband, standing outside the villa, staring at them through the window. "He knows," Clare said, her voice like ice. "Ethan has been watching you. If he hasn't acted yet, it's only because he's waiting for the right moment." Laura felt as though the air had been sucked from the room. Her chest tightened, her mind racing. Ethan, the man she had once loved, the man she had tried to build a life with, was now a shadow hanging over her every move. "You need to leave, Laura," Clare continued, her tone softening but no less resolute. "Not for Elliot's sake, but for your own. If Ethan decides to act, you won't get a second chance." Laura looked at her friend, tears brimming in her eyes. "But what about Elliot?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "He's all I have left." Clare shook her head gently, her expression both sympathetic and firm. "He can't be everything, Laura. And he needs to find his own way to heal, just as you do. You've crossed lines that can't be undone. But you still have a chance to start over, somewhere far from here." Laura sat in silence, the weight of Clare's words crushing her. Deep down, she knew her friend was right. She had to leave. But the thought of abandoning Elliot, of leaving behind the only connection that had made her feel alive, was unbearable. Her heart ached in a way she hadn't thought possible. The next morning, Laura packed her belongings. She left a letter on the table, its words brief but heavy. "Elliot, I don't know if you'll ever forgive me, but I hope you live a life I cannot destroy. Don't come looking for me, because I've chosen to leave. Not because I want to, but because I must. Laura." As her car rolled away from the villa, Laura glanced in the rearview mirror. The lake lay eerily still, its surface betraying none of the turmoil beneath. But she knew that beneath the serene facade, the undercurrents never truly rested. A few days later, Clare received a phone call. Ethan's voice came through, calm but tinged with an unsettling edge. "She's gone, isn't she?" he said. "Laura did the right thing. But Elliot's still there. Do you think I'll just let this go?" Clare froze, her breath catching in her throat. Ethan's words carried a weight she knew all too well. He was not one to make idle threats. But before she could respond, he hung up, leaving only the chilling silence of the deadline. And so, the story ends, or so it seems. But for those watching, the questions linger like a storm refusing to pass. What will Ethan do next? How will Elliot react when he finds Laura's letter? And Laura, has she truly escaped the shadow of her choices, or is this just the prelude to a far greater tragedy?